So welcome to Know Now Booster. Know Now Booster is a concept of short webinars that last somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. The idea is to cover a different variety of topics and make sure that we provide you with some instant knowledge and tips and tricks that you get to start using in your business world. So today's topic is governance, who is responsible and for what. So we have dedicated this topic to potentially new board members or board members who have been engaged in their own boards but are still striving some tips and tricks and maybe to give them some ideas of what kind of role responsibilities there are, what different roles there are in terms of governance and responsibilities between these roles, and also some of the tips and tricks. So today with us we have Chairman of Youth Bank International, Norman Leet. Norman Leet has over 25 years of experience when it comes to working in organization development. He has been engaged in businesses of different sizes on global level and in different sectors, and we definitely are 100% sure that he is the right person to be leading this webinar. So Norman, I will stop the share, you take over, the floor is yours.
So as Katia says, I have been in and around organisations for a long time, particularly in the charitable sector for the last 20 years, and I'm currently chair of 3 organisations in the UK, and I have had the privilege of working in many countries with the Community Foundation to set up other NGOs and charities. So the aim of this session is really to share a very personal view on governance, roles, approaches to working on boards, as it says on the screen. It's taking that practical experience. So I'm not going to give a legal presentation. I don't feel I'm qualified on the technicalities, but on the overall view of governance and how it works in organizations, and particularly in these uncertain times where many countries are facing particularly financial sustainability challenges and resource challenges. So that's where we're going to go with this. I also have some questions that I will try and answer as we go. So what do we say governance is? I like to think of it broadly as the headline here. So it is about setting the overall direction. It's the systems and processes that do that, and it's taking the accountability to ensure the organisation is aligned to its own constitution. And however that works in your country, I know languages are different, but what's the purpose, the governing document for your charity, and any objects or articles that we would have in the UK. So it's the board's responsibility to overview that. So I feel that I would say good governance ensures NGOs and charities, they make a difference to society, and it's about the objects or the purpose of your charity and making sure that's advanced. And for me, it's always the trustees and the board's role to keep that at the front of their mind. If I'm honest, in experience, as organisations mature and get older, it's surprising how few boards actually have a connection back to that purpose. So it becomes important that each board, as it renews and inducts new trustees or directors, actually ensures that trustee knows its governing document and the purpose. Clearly, it has to comply with the law within your country and the regulations, and has strong policies and processes that enable that to happen. And the board as an organisation is well run, it's got good controls and is sustainable. And I'll say a bit more about controls later. Those controls have to be at a sensible level and not interfere with the executives running of an organisation. I guess governance for me is also about forward looking, anticipating risk, problems and challenges that are identified early and dealt with appropriately. Again, I'll say a bit more about this as we get into the conversation, because invariably too many boards are backwards looking and not forward looking, and therefore get in the way again of the executive's work. So again, a challenge for the board is to remain forward looking, to think about the future challenges and problems, and hopefully has high quality trustees who are good at looking into the future in their own respective areas of expertise. Also, for me, governance is about the preservation of the reputation of the integrity of the organisation and the sector. It's important that in the UK, we would say charity. Clearly, in most of the world, we would talk about the NGO sector or the third sector. It's important that not only do we preserve the integrity of our own organisation, but also the whole sector. That builds credibility and is important to all of us. And finally, that we actually have, as an organisation, the processes and systems to ensure all people are developed and cared for. That also, for me, sits at the level of governance. And it's important that, as a set of trustees or board members, directors, we're in contact with that and we're closer to our people without interfering, but we know our organisation and we know our people. So for me, governance sits at that level. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward. So I guess the opposite of governance is executive, your MDs, your CEOs, your teams. And again, as a chair of an organisation, I find it more and more important that I help the trustees remain clear what's the executive's role as opposed to the trustees' role, and that we don't get in the way of that unless invited by the executive to join. So executives and teams, for me, design the strategies and they have the clear plans to deliver these. It doesn't mean they can't invite the trustees to help if they've got the skills, but it's the executive's lead. Develop the capability and the capacity of the organisation, delivering the strategies and the plans. Clearly, you hope any scale of organisation, depending on its complexity and need, has a set of plans and at least a broad heading of strategy of direction. It understands the culture it's trying to achieve, and that the executive are good at recruiting, developing their teams, taking care of their people. It's for them to implement policy, for them to maintain the standards of the organisation. And again, I see the incomes, building financial sustainability clearly sits within the executive and their teams' roles. That doesn't mean there's not a big place for the board. And I'll say a bit more about where I see the difference as we go on. And in short, the executive and the team's role is to achieve the desired performance to create a sustainable organisation in line with whatever it is that organisation sets out to do. And as with these, I'll talk as I go. Many trustees and board directors, actually, the ones I work with and coach, can often get trapped into a level of executive. It tends to be very much around what they've been successful for. So many trustees come from the executive. They've been successful by making decisions, by leading their businesses, by leading their functions. And invariably, that's where they enter the world of governance. And sometimes it takes a while to help them let that go and to realize governance and the trustee directorship is slightly different requirement. And that unlearning can be difficult. So I'd kind of flag that up as a watch out for any organization, that it needs to help new trustees, particularly if they come from an executive or doing background, to make that transition. What else would I say? So what do I say the trustee or the director role is in governance? And I'm very clear here that this is with colleagues on the board. And as the watch out says on the board at the bottom, there should never be a case where an individual on the board should have any power as an individual to make decisions. There can only be collective decisions at the level of the board. A lot of people are asking questions around how do you ensure good governance? How do you ensure quality of governance? Part of it has to come from making sure that the board operate as a unit, a team, a collective, a collaborative. You hear lots of horror stories doing this work about board members dropping into executive roles or making independent decisions. That's kind of cannot happen, and that would need rectifying if you find that the board and trustees are getting in the executive's world, especially if they're not invited. So what does all of that mean? Well, what we would hope there is in any board is a methodology to sign off on a strategy. So for me, again, the executive need to put that together. They build their strategies, they make clear their plans are in place, and then they bring that to the board for challenge and sign off. So good governance would enable a strategy to be challenged objectively, to be questioned, wherever there are challenges, to be put back to the executive to come back with answers or collaborate on finding the answers before a strategy is signed off. But for me, it always remains imperative that the executive and their teams deliver the strategy. They have to own it. It's their world. They believe it. As trustees and board members, we tend to come in and out of the organisation. So it's important they know their organisation. They put that in place. Equally, it's important once the strategy is signed off that we have the controls in place that enable us as board members to measure and hold our executives to account on what it is they say they're going to do. Clearly, as a trustee and a director, we need good processes and procedures that ensure legislation and regulation is in place. Again, a challenge I have in all the organisations I chair is in making that process come to life. So it isn't that we don't have good policies, and it isn't that we don't have good procedures. It tends to be that we don't have good review processes that enable us to live and breathe them. We don't put dates on documents and policies and come back and review them. We tend to put them in a drawer and say they're done. And if we're challenged, we can say we have them, rather than enabling them to breathe. So one of the key roles, I believe, not the most exciting role of trustees, is to ensure that that's happening in your organisation and that policies and procedures are both updated and lived out, and that risk is captured. Clearly, reputation and brand of the organisation is protected at all times. Again, hoping trustees and directors are asking good questions that challenge any decisions that may bring the organisation into risk or disrepute. Good practices for the well-being and performance of our colleagues, both in terms of employees, associates, volunteers, that they're paid, remunerated, looked after, their conditions are good, and the business is financially viable and sustainable. So what are the tools we need to do that? And I'll say a bit more about some of the tools that we use to support that. And going back to the challenge I laid out at the beginning, for all trustees and boards, good governance comes where risk is identified in the business proactively. So what is it we think is going to happen in 12 months or 2 years? Or what are these risks that we need to anticipate that enables us to be proactive and then to support our executive? So for me, every trustee who's recruited, every director who's recruited to a board, this really is the core role. So we often recruit people to do other things and don't talk to our trustees often enough about governance. So the starting point for a trustee, a director, for me, is understanding the core role is the governance role, and understanding the accountability that brings, and understanding the organisation and the culture within which we're going to ask you to do that. So as a chair, whenever I'm recruiting, I start with this conversation with the trustee, and they may have other brilliant things they bring, but they have to be prepared to do the heart of the role, and this would be core to their job description. However, we also want trustees and directors for many other things that are really important to us. And that, I guess I've got a list here, which won't be new. Depending on your organisation, getting somebody who's got the legal or the financial sector knowledge, the HR biz dev. We sometimes need experts. I, for one, am less keen on that. I tend to like to invite people to help us and volunteer their time on that. It's things we can find, but I know others who would be very keen to have them as part of their board teams. I tend to like to find user groups or people of the community who we're impacting and working with, in our case, young people, and ensuring that those young people are trained and supported to bring what a young person can bring in terms of thinking and direction, and people who've got broader knowledge in the world. But it's a choice. So what is it you want them to be? I guess another role is taking part in committees and leading committees. For me, a big part of boards is to be able to bring some committee work together and group work together that enables longer term thinking. We'd expect our trustees, obviously, we might recruit for sharing networks and connections, their gravitas, their position in the sector, their position in society or in your town or your village. We might want them to be an ambassador and an advocate to speak at events and a volunteer to do work, build webs, whatever. But that's kind of bringing them for who they are. So as I talk to that, I guess my next question for clarity on the board work and the executive and not contradicting myself is to say, well, actually, when I'm doing this work, where does it sit or where does it fit in a structure? And the best way I can describe it is, if you look at the map I've got out, the picture, we've got a chair and a CEO or a president and a managing director, depending on your countries. who have to work as a team, and they have to be clear where that accountability lies, and the chair and their team looking at board governance strategy, all the things I've talked about. I'd also describe the chair's role and the board's role is to lead committees that are meaningful and long-term. So what do I mean by those kind of committees? They can be remuneration benefits, they can be legal policy, they could be long-term sustainability, business development committees, but are those things that are long-term and the executive and their teams, A, don't have the skills or the capabilities, and probably don't have the team, in my experience. Time to think and time to breathe when you're in an executive beyond 12 months is really hard work when you're dealing with the day-to-day pressures of running your organization and the pressures of the income streams or the pressures of the people challenges or customers. So what are those things that you can take away that the chair and their team can support? And so often in our businesses, we'll have one, maybe two committees on the go at any given time. And the committees are different in the sense they, as long as we have one board member on them, we can get anybody else involved. So somebody said, can a staff member become a board member? My answer to that would probably be, they might be able to based on your governing body, but I think it's a really bad idea. It creates a massive conflict of interest for that person. And in reality, if you were to employ any of your staff on the board, then they're employing themselves because the board leads the business. So I think that would be unhelpful. However, any number of staff, any number of volunteers, any number of specialists, people who want to volunteer from your communities can come and sit on those committees and give some time freely, 3 times a year, maybe for 2 hours, and use their skills and knowledge to enhance the thinking that's needed to run your organization. And as long as there's a good terms of reference, a good set of boundaries for each committee, and it reports to the board, committees can be a very powerful way of doing lots more work, engaging lots more people from your communities and organizations to deliver longer term governance strategy and help. And in some cases, the board would also help support patrons. So is there a person, famous or otherwise, who may be able to work on behalf of your organization to raise money or to raise profile? That to me sits very clearly with the board and is looked after by your board. And obviously at the bottom, you see that everybody, we need values, relationships and behaviors. This can't be done in isolation. So where would a board member report to an executive member? If the executive's team is the doing, it is to support volunteers, it is to run the projects of the organization. So projects for me are very different to committees. Projects have a start and an end. They could be finding new premises. They could be running end-to-end marathons, income streams, activities. So all things that are active sit really with the executive team. So where a board member might want to help build a website, if that's their skill set, or volunteer to run a marathon or organization of something that's happening, or to speak on behalf of the organization, all of which for me as a chair, I expect my trustees to report to whichever whichever executive team member that leads that. So at the minute we have Ollie, a guy who's incredibly good at entrepreneur marketing. He's working in the executive team with Katja to try and help support that, but he doesn't report to me. He talks to the executive team. And to avoid confusion, to enable governance and the board to work in a good way, to not have crossover, it becomes really important to understand the roles and the reporting lines. The piece I leave in the middle is whether you have a youth advisory board or whether you have an employee advisory board. Your choice as to whether that reports to a board or an executive team. It depends on each organization's need and how that's supported. So I guess the key message for me in all of this is for trustees and directors is, number one, you're there to govern. Number two, whatever work you then take on, be very clear where it is you're impacting your organization. If you're going to be working on the executive side, be clear that's where you're working and giving your time. And if you're going to be leading a committee, then that's an enhancement of the board role. So hopefully that is all very clear. So I have 3 more slides, I guess, without going into information overload. When starting with any board, I work with or chair or go to work, these I guess are questions that need answers. So what is your board need to do? Constitution, legal requirements, government requirements of your countries. What is it there to value add? It still amazes me how few trustees and directors know how their organization is constituted, know the articles, or know the governing processes of their organization. They tend to come in at a level of how can I help, and don't necessarily get inducted into a place that goes, well, what is it I'm really here to do? Somebody asked, how do you get your trustees to get more excited or involved in governance? It has to start with them understanding that's the, I guess, the core role. We'd hope that's why you're recruited, but equally you may have some tools that can help them, and I'll say a bit more about those tools as we move into the next slide. But if that's not understood by everybody, executive and board alike, then I tend to find I have a confusion on my hands. And as the new chair or the new board member, I'm trying to understand, well, hang on, how many people can make a meeting? How can we make that decision? What do we need to do? And so clearing that up always helps. My next question, I guess, when I take on a role, particularly as the chair, is what does my executive team want from me? What does the organization want from the board? How can we add value? What are the gaps? What is it the executive team has that it doesn't need from us because it's going to be strong in some areas, not in others? A lot of the NGOs I work with are very strong in certain areas, but because of financial constraints and the core cost implications, it's very hard for them to have a broad enough team to do all the work. So what is it the executive want and need from the board, and who might we get that would help strengthen our organization? Next is a question I'm always left thinking about is, what are the challenges historically? How have my organization, how have the people in the organization historically experienced the board? I've had some good experiences where it's been great. I've had some bad experiences where the board have been held in status, where people see them as a hierarchy, as all powerful. And I find it's very important immediately to break that down. Wherever boards are using positional power and status power over influence and relationships, that for me immediately creates a disconnect in an organization and makes a question as to how well is that board servicing its organization. So again, if there's a challenge there, I'll say a bit more about some of the tools I use in a minute to help with that. Clearly, scale and complexity. Some of you who may listen to this may have big organizations with many millions of euros or dollars budgets, and some maybe, as at least one of mine is, managing to survive on maybe 100,000 euros a year, and still do amazing work. But it's really important as a board, we think about scale and complexity. We think very hard about how do we keep it simple for smaller organizations, particularly? How do we strip away a lot of the bureaucracy or complexity we can build into governance and boards? And how can we make that very simple for our executives and support them? Equally, in a bigger organization, how do we actually make sure we're sophisticated enough to have the controls in place to deal with the more processes and the more layers of operations that are going on? And therefore, once we know that, I'm really always interested to help understand how does our current strategy and performance line up with all of those things, and look into the future and the challenges ahead. How do we anticipate and have the right data? And equally, boards, unlike many organizations, tend not to have appraisals or feedback systems. So I'm also very keen to try and get user groups and staff groups involved in feeding back and giving performance related feedback to the board, which keeps them honest and real, but as long as they understand the board's role in governance. So they would all be the places that I would start and hopefully answer some of your questions. I guess key to all of that, and common sense, I apologize if it sounds patronizing, but I'm really keen on my current board. What are they motivated to contribute? Who are we missing? And by that, I often mean an inherited board. A lot of the teams I've inherited don't want to do governance or don't understand governance. So how do we help them do that? But equally, what is it they really want to deliver? What is it they're excited about in this organization? And how can we ensure that they can give their best to that in a way that's right for the organization and right for them? And I guess the last bit is how to allow the board members to be at their best and still achieve good governance. And that's that's always an ongoing conversation. So as the chair of the organization, I will try and meet with my board one-to-one at least twice a year and just have informal conversations about how it's working for them and vice versa. And again, with the CEO or the teams, to have plenty of conversations to ensure what we're doing is delivering to them and that the board are delivering that. So I guess they're questions I start with, and that's how I see the role evolving. I'm hoping that makes some sense. In terms of governance, what are the tools that can help? Again, I'm often surprised at the lack of tools that are in place for an organization. I'm not saying some are brilliant, some have amazing, some tend to have less. By way of thinking about governance and how to support the organization, the following tools are the tools I would always want to have in place. They take time. Somebody asked about how do we enhance the teamwork of the board. I genuinely believe trustees and boards should have a charter or a set of principles and standards that they agree and they work together on and they review. Standards would talk to things that often happen in boards about how many board meetings do I have to make a year, and what if I miss a couple of board meetings. So it's important the board agree their standards. There's often a big dissension when people are missing 2 or 3 meetings and we don't know what the standards are, or not turning up on time, or not doing their pre-reads. So all of which can sound very petty, but in my experience working with boards and trustees, it's the bit that can get in the way the very quickest. It can cause a lot of upset. So getting those common agreements, those common standards, and reviewing them becomes key to any trustee or board working well together. And to neglect that, I believe, is inviting some trouble. What else do I believe the board need? Well, I believe the board need at least a dashboard or some kind of measures and inputs that the executive agree against the strategy to report on. I'd hope to think there were only 4 to 8 and it's not a massive list and they're at the right level. But I believe it's the executive's job to report on certain measures. And I think in terms of it, what are the key 2 or 3 input measures that would tell us things are on track? What are some of the activities outputs that have been achieved, and what are the outcomes? So we have to have them balanced. They have to be across the things that would tell us our business is really healthy or unhealthy. Finance is always the obvious one, but actually staff retention, all of those kind of things that give us an indication, user satisfaction. What is it we are measuring that actually tell us that our organization is in really great shape and our executive team are doing a great job in delivering strategy? And more importantly, that we know we're well for the long term. Cash flow forecast linked to known and predicted income. So somebody asked about what do I think, or how do trustees deal with finances? If it's your charitable finance, if it's your accounts and your returns, then there are specialists involved for that. But I believe that every trustee should have kind of finance for non-financial management understanding. And as a minimum, that means your trustees would understand a cash flow, a balance sheet, the management accounts, and budgets. And if they can understand those 4 tools, and they don't have to know how to put them together, they just have to know how to interpret those numbers. What do the patterns tell us? What's interesting? What are the questions that these numbers are generating for us as we look forward? So why do I love a cash flow? I love a cash flow because I want to know in 18 months' time against how much it costs me to run my organization versus how much money is coming in, how much money will be in the bank. And it sounds simple, but again, I can only talk to the UK where I'm a chair, but in all the organizations I've worked with, I've had to set these up to try and get people to think about what's the core running cost of your organization? When does the money come in? How does the money come in? And what does that mean in terms of the next 18 months? And so getting your executive to start to think with you about how much money will we have in the bank in 18 months' time? What does that mean to us? Will the money run out before 18 months' time? And invariably, that's true. It could, it will. So unless the trustees and the board are asking their finance teams, accountants, their executives, whomever, to give them that long-term understanding of the numbers, how do you generate sustainability and how do you take care of everybody in your organization? So I link the cash flow to income, whether you're an organization who make your money through charitable bid writing, whether it's through you have deliverable services, however, whether it's because you can win projects or people donate. It's absolutely key that you can understand your forecast, what kind of money's coming in when, with what certainty is that money coming in, and how does that go with the business. And if the trustees are only doing that, they're immediately helping their executive. They're immediately helping them think into the future. They're immediately helping them think of problems that they may not have noticed beforehand. So that's one tool, linked to the cash flow forecast, linked to the income. The next for me is a risk register kept up to date with contingency plans. From a governance point of view, I think there's nothing more important than thinking out for the next 18 months. What are the risks my organization, our organization will take? What would happen if we lose the CEO? What would happen if there's a downturn in the market? What would happen if our local council was to go bankrupt, something that's happening in England quite regularly at the minute? What would happen if our local authority was no longer prepared to give us any money to run our courses? They're all big governance questions. What would happen if? And starting to think about those questions and starting to give them a rating. So there are two things I ask against a risk register. How likely is that impact? And what would that impact mean in terms of what it means? So likelihood and impact. What's the likelihood of any risk happening? What's the impact of that risk? If the likelihood and the impact are high, it's the trustee's job with the executive to think about, well, what are we going to do? Spend a bit of time thinking, if that's going to happen, what would we do? It massively improves the organization's chances of reacting agile and well to anything that may happen and give them a better chance of survival in difficult times. What else do we get up to? Talent maps and succession planning link into. So if we know what the capability and capacity is we need in the future, we need to understand who's out there, who have we got in our teams who we can bring through and develop. Where will my next CEO or my next FD or my next project manager come from? Is it in-house? Is it an associate? No matter how big your business, they're questions we should be continually asking. How can I get more talent in my organization? As a chair, it's a question I ask continually. I don't believe you can ever have too much talent in your organization. So finding the talented people, the passionate people, inviting them to join you when you can, recognizing when it's other people's time to leave. What are we going to do? Equally, stakeholder maps and engagement. I don't know what your charities or your NGOs are, but for me, it's about, well, who are the key stakeholders and who are the people we need to be engaging with, whether that be for change projects, whether that be for money, whether that be longer term relationships. But ensuring all my trustees know who the stakeholders are is really key. It's very easy to not know. It's very easy to turn up to meetings and not understand who the funders are, who the user groups are. So again, starting to build that into your trustees, and we're talking a mature board now who've been together for a while. We need a clear process to manage policy and regulation. I spoke about it earlier, but it's not about having the process and policies in place. It's about living and breathing them, getting them out and reviewing them. It's a great place for either a committee work or to find somebody from a legal background or an HR background who's maybe prepared to do some free work for you to review them from time to time. It becomes really important longer term. And as I said earlier on, I'm not clever use of committees, project work, groups to engage more people. They're all kind of key to me. And committees takes, again, a mature board who are used to working, who feel constant and settled. So they're the tools that I believe in. They're the tools that I like to use over time. Hopefully they give an instruction on if that's happening, you know, you've got good governance. Invariably, if these tools aren't in place, and people were asking again about what does good governance look like, for me, there's a risk that boards can spend too much time looking backwards. If you're talking into budgets, if you're talking into management accounts or balance sheets, you're talking into history. These are things that have happened. I know they're important, and I know, but I'd hope my executive know what they are. I'd hope my executive have put a good budget together. I feel free to challenge them. It's my job. It's the board's job. But I'm much more interested in how well is that board looking forward? How well is that board supporting the organization by being ahead? And most of these tools are all designed to make us look forward as a trustee group, as a board group. And if we're doing that, very rarely will our governance be challenged. So there's some tools, there's some questions. What else do I try and do? This is a bit longer term, but I also recognize, to contradict myself, that lots of trustees have amazing qualities, amazing connections, amazing skills they want to bring and give, and they don't all enjoy the governance. So one of the things we've started to develop, particularly at Youth Bank, is a governance light team. So what we've started to do now, we've got the tools in place, is build a small team who own the governance on behalf of the board. That doesn't mean the other board members don't look at that work, but what we start to do is bring all the documents together we need, send them out to everybody 2 weeks, get the questions back in, and then that group just takes care of the governance. And we try to present that at a board meeting for 20 minutes. Make sure we take all the actions outside of the board meeting. There's nothing worse than having long conversations in board meetings about actions and decisions. Once we know what we're doing, take them outside of the board meeting. We can have much more valuable time in the board meeting with our trustees if we're talking about the future and what needs to happen, not trying to decide constantly on actions and where we are. If we can repeat that quarterly, if we can use the tools and the disciplines I've mentioned before, it allows for much more proactive conversations around longer term key performance indicators or measures or challenges. And it allows those sessions to be led by different trustees and directors with skills and knowledges that allow you, the trustees, to really kind of have a lot of fun in the organisation and bring what they want to with hopefully a future perspective. So it won't work for everybody, but trying to keep governance really at the centre but light, for me, becomes the key to the success of an organisation, and allows trustees and board members to add even more value in other areas. But I guess governance first is always my message. Get that right as a core, then your trustees and boards can really grow. I sometimes fear it's the other way around, that people forget the governance. They've got all these great trustees, and then trying to get governance back into an organisation becomes very difficult. So that's it, really. I could probably talk for hours. I'm under instructions not to talk for hours. So I'm really hoping that that has given everybody some practical ideas, answered some of the questions, but if not, Katya has assured me that we will capture the questions and write to them later on. So with that, Katya, I believe I'm finished. Thank you.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Norman.